Welcome to another episode of IDP TV. Thank you for joining us. Today we have Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois Congressional 6th District. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Diane. I love your fashion.
Thank you. I thought it was quite appropriate. I'm a fan from way back. So the first question that we have is, I think it would be helpful to remind folks about who you are, your background, and
Sure.
what you bring to us.
Long-time chemical engineer, entrepreneur, first-time caller. So I spent 20 years in the clean energy world. I started off as a biochemist doing basic research, and then got a degree in chemical engineering working on biofuels, and then got my first job working on fuel cells and battery technology, and basically became convinced that if I was going to do something in my life about climate change, this was really a business problem more than a science problem. And so started a couple different companies that ultimately built 80 clean energy projects, put a couple $100 million to work, and really would have happily still been doing that. But we got to a point where if you are not born with $200 million in your pocket, but you deploy $200 million of other people's money, eventually they get to decide to sell your company. And so September 16th, we sold our company. September of 2016, we sold the company. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next, and Trump happened. And so, really, felt like I had reached a point in my life where I was fortunate enough to have choices. And the single most important thing to me was now under threat from a president who doesn't believe in the Enlightenment or climate change, and a House of Representatives at the time in the last Congress that seemed to think their job was just to be a rubber stamp for him. And so decided to run, and obviously that's a short version of a longer story, but flipped a seat and became part of, I think, a pretty cool freshman class where there's a whole lot of people with a whole lot of experience in other venues who didn't set out to be members of Congress, but I think have significantly elevated the congressional game.
Yes.
And proud to be a part of that group.
It's very exciting. Now, what would you say, as you've been looking back over the last year, was your main accomplishment, or your main sets of accomplishments?
I got to start by saying what I haven't gotten done. I came in because I think climate change is the number one, number two, number three problem that I want to try to solve with my life, and have succeeded in basically becoming a voice within the Congress to articulate that lowering the amount of fuel we use to make energy is actually an investment, not a cost, and getting my colleagues to perceive that and understand that, and changing some of the narrative and having some impact on getting some bills through, whether it was a bill we got to deploy more battery energy storage, or a bill to stand up a whole agency at the Department of Energy to figure out how to decarbonize hard to decarbonize industries, to a bill that we did to direct the SEC to require companies to disclose their exposure to a changing climate in a consistent way. That last one is through committee, but not to the floor yet. And all of that stuff, seen from one lens, is a huge amount more than I accomplished over a professional career in terms of the scale. To deploy $200 million of capital and over 16 years build a business, which was my resume before this point, that sounds like a big deal. Now I can pass a bill that says, let's set up a $600 million agency at DOE to figure out how to decarbonize these industries. Let's deploy $500 million of grid storage. Just the levers you can pull are huge. And in that way, they're big accomplishments. On the other hand, relative to what we need to do, they're dinks. And I think we got to be honest about that. We shouldn't be boastful when we say there's this is what's necessary. Mm-hmm. This is what is considered to be politically possible. And here's what I've gotten done so far. And here's was a pretty successful, corporate career. So we're moving up, but we got to keep our eye on the prize and keep pushing, because we're running out of time to deal with this problem.
Yes, we are. That's a really great response. What would you say is on your agenda then for the next term?
Well,
or like a 2 to 4 year term?
So I've actually just finished writing a manifesto for my staff that will. The goal is not to leak this, but basically to set out how are we going to create climate policy that is sufficient to the scale of the challenge. And before, when I get back, we've got a bill that we're going to release to essentially clarify the role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who I think has largely abandoned obligations that Congress gave them in 1935 to look after environmental issues, including carbon, and they've taken that away. And so we're sort of clarifying some of that, which I think could have a big difference in how we structure power markets in this country, to a huge, massive carbon regulation bill, carbon pricing. I am of the opinion, having spent as much time in the industry as I have, that every bill we've ever done to price carbon has been wrong, has been flawed for the same reasons. And so we've got a bill about this thick that I've written and not shared with any of my colleagues. I've talked to them about it and they say, can I see it? And I say, no, until it's done, you can't see it. Hopefully in the next month or so we'll have that prepared to release to fix to be sort of up to the challenge. And
that's exciting.
Yeah, and it's fun. It's a lot of work, and we're pushing it through. And then, of course, we've got in March, the Select Climate Committee that I'm on will release essentially our report to the Congress of what we need to do for a climate policy, and that'll be a collaborative work with my colleagues on that committee. But I think the big challenge, and what I started to say, I need a better word than manifesto, but this report that we're working on with staff is essentially to acknowledge my little hand gesture from before. If what's necessary exceeds what's politically possible, what is our strategy to close that gap? And for so many things in Washington, the conversation says, what is politically possible and how do we get as close to that as we can? Mm-hmm. Which is fine, but you can take a whole, climate's just one issue, like, gun control. We are afraid, even as good, loyal Democrats, we're afraid to have a conversation about the fact that we have too many guns.
True.
Right? I mean, that is to say that, people are going to say, how dare you? That's protect our Second Amendment rights.
But we need to have those conversations.
Yeah, no, and the conversation that I keep telling my colleagues I'd like to have is, I'd love to see an ad run that shows the streets of Yemen and people walking around with their assault rifles and shooting guns in the air. And, you've seen the images on the news, right? And then show the streets of the United States and, go through and then just gradually release statistics and say, I want to be Yemen. Because Yemen has 0.57 guns per capita. The United States has 1.1. No reasonable person would say that the average Yemeni's Second Amendment rights are limited. But for us to strive to be Yemen means we'd have to take away about 150 million guns. We need to have that conversation, understand it, and we don't because we don't close that gap. So what I'm trying to do is, at least with climate, let's get staff and let's get my colleagues acknowledging what's necessary, and then talking about how to close the gap.
As an activist, I thoroughly applaud that, and will definitely make sure that our organizations help support Congress people that do that, because I think that's something that absolutely must happen, and I'm super glad that you're doing that. That's very exciting from an activist perspective. A top issue for Democrats is providing affordable health care. You voted to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Tell us about how and what the high prices of prescription drugs have meant for your district and constituents. I can start with drugs. I don't want to lose the thread of healthcare, because there are two separate issues, and we've done a whole lot on one of them, and we're playing defense on the other. There's the structure of our healthcare markets. Right? Mm-hmm. Which anything we're going to do to really fix the healthcare system, we got to deal with that structural piece. And we've been playing defense on that. There then is separately, whatever the structure is, if you like Medicare for all, if you like the ACA, if you've got some other idea,
in any of those structures, you got to do something about the price of drugs, right? Because whether you pay or I pay or taxpayers pay, it makes the system more expensive if the drugs cost too much. And so we've really done two separate bills. They were both sort of a bunch of ideas that came together. But the most recent one was H.R. 3, which finally mostly restored Medicare's ability to negotiate with the drug companies, which was a right that Medicare always had and was taken away during the George W. Bush administration. Now, when I say we fixed that, I mean we, the House. McConnell doesn't fix anything, so nothing's happened in the Senate on this, but we have done our work, and when you elect adults, look what happens. Like, good policy. So that bill, number one, directs, it actually requires the Department of Health and Human Services to negotiate for, I think, I may have the number wrong, it's either 120 or 200 costliest drugs, which is not to say the ones that have the highest per dose price, but the ones that we spend the most on as a society. So for example, like insulin, which costs $500 a dose, is a lot cheaper than an AIDS drug, as an example. But we buy a lot of insulin. So insulin's on the list of the top 200. So it says that they would negotiate with those. It then further says that no drug shall cost more than 120% of the international price average, which, as Chairman Pallone from the Energy and Commerce said, he said any drug company who objects to this bill, we just need to point out to them that the United States will still be the largest and most profitable market for pharmaceuticals, so you'll still be here, right? Because we're saying you can charge 120% of what's anywhere else, but you can't charge 500, 600% as we are right now. It says that the price of pharmaceuticals can't increase faster than the rate of inflation, which protects for some of the more egregious practices that have happened. And then lastly, and this gets to something that really matters for folks, not just in the 6th District, but everywhere, is it closes the Part D donut hole. So if you're Medicare eligible, when the Medicare system was set up, the pharmaceuticals were a tiny part of our healthcare system. And so there was just this gap of where Medicare coverage, your pharmaceutical prices was a certain amount of coverage, but didn't go beyond that, and it didn't matter because it was a small piece. As drugs have become a really significant cost, people, even on Medicare, are spending a ton of out-of-pocket money, even though they have Medicare coverage, because you get into what's called the donut hole. So what this does is solves that by saying nobody will spend more than $2,000 out of pocket per year on drugs who's in the Medicare program. So it gives you some stability, especially for older folks on fixed incomes, to manage that piece of it. So that was all in H.R. 3. The other bill that we did, and I'm forgetting the number of it, but it stapled together a number of bills that were designed to address things that should be illegal but weren't in the pharmaceutical pricing model. So for example, if you have developed a drug, you've brought it to market, you've gone through the patent period, and you've earned a ton of money because you had a monopoly because of your patent, which is fine. Like, you did all the innovation to get this done. Now at the end of the patent period, generic company comes along and wants to produce your drug. They need a pure sample of your drug to figure out how to manufacture it. Well, a lot of companies were withholding those pure samples, so even though your patent period was expired, you couldn't game it. So we made that illegal. There was another, I keep saying this is past tense. If the Senate would pass what we did, this would be past tense. These things are all still legal today.
Right.
Right now, again, same scenario, the pharmaceutical, you take it out. Let's say you're making a number, $1 billion a year selling this drug. It's now going to go off patent, and there's a generic who wants to sell it, and it's going to only cost $1 million a year. I'm just making up numbers. You don't want to lose that profit. So you might say to the generic, I will pay you $10 million a year to not bring this to market. Generic saying, that's awesome, because I was only going to make $1 million, now I'm making $10 million. You're still making a bunch of money on the other side. So that is currently allowed. We've made that illegal in this bill. There's then a third practice called parking, where the generic manufacturers, if you have a big complicated manufacturing process, a lot of FDA approvals to get up and make this. As you might imagine, once the generic market's open, you have to go through and ask for the FDA approvals to get it done. And it's not instantly a ton of competition. So the FDA has a certain sequencing process of, okay, you apply to do this, we're going to give you a 6-month exclusivity window to go and get your process in place, and we'll check you out before we bring someone else online. Well, there's been this practice of some of the generics filing and then not moving, and therefore giving the initial producers more time. So again, we've passed a bunch of bills to take care of these things. They're just sort of common sensey things that have been gamed around. So all of those things, if you take them together, we have a pretty significant impact on lowering the cost of prescription drugs. One of the really clever things that they did in HR 3, the Medicare bill, is that bill, I got to remember the numbers, it saves the country something on the order of $500 billion a year, because we spend so much money for Medicare, right? That if the drugs are cheaper, we're now saving money. It also saves employers a ton of money, because if employers are providing both either through FICA taxes for Medicare or through drugs that are now subject to this 120% cap, they save a bunch of money, and it saves you and me a bunch of money. And so what the bill does is take a chunk of that savings, and rather than give it all to taxpayers or to put women in the federal government, sends it back to NIH to develop new drugs. So the idea is to keep the innovation engine going and make sure that nobody could make the argument that by making drugs cheaper, we're removing the incentive to innovate. Because in fact, most of the new drugs that come to market all start from NIH. And once NIH has developed a drug that cures a disease, everybody wants to sell it, right? So it's a lot of nice stuff that should make people healthier and wealthier once certain people on the other side of Capitol Hill choose to act on it.
Well, hopefully in 2020 we have a Senate that
yes.
actually moves. So, right. That's very enlightening. We just need a Senate to pass those bills. The next question would be salt is a big issue to folks in this district. Tell us how you're tackling that on a federal level.
So salt, the state and local tax deduction, this district has the 12th highest state and local tax of any congressional district in the country. And I am in this job in part because my predecessor campaigned on the prior tax bill that essentially caused everybody to be double taxed on it.
Right.
So Congresswoman Underwood and I, almost like the first month we were there, introduced a bill that would have, so right now the salt cap is at $10,000 under the Republican tax bill from 2015. We introduced a bill that said let's double it to 15 and let's allow married couples to double the deduction and take it to 30. And we did that not because I'd like to go back to the way it was before the 2015 tax bill, but it gets to be fairly expensive to totally repeal without a pay for. And the prior Congress, this is an interesting thing, the Republican Party campaigns as being the party of fiscal responsibility. They suspended their rules that required them to keep the budgets in balance in order to pass the tax bill that gave us $1.5 trillion of deficits. That's sort of like saying I don't believe in murder, but I'm going to suspend these rules while I drop an atomic bomb, right?
Right.
It's really, really, the technical term is stupid. When we came in, bound ourselves by rules that said we're not going to pass anything that's going to increase deficits. But if we're going to repeal that tax cut, we got to pay for it somehow. So we proposed that approach. There were a couple other approaches going around. The Ways and Means Committee considered all three and ultimately came up with a proposal to eliminate the salt deduction over the course of 2 years, and so eliminate and basically go back to not eliminate the salt deduction, eliminate the elimination of the salt deduction. So restore your ability to fully deduct it. And so it was more than Congresswoman Underwood and I thought was possible. And then paid for it by restoring the top marginal individual tax rate. Because a part of what was done in the last tax bill was that the Republicans had decided that they didn't give enough tax breaks to rich people. And so we restored the top marginal tax rate, which provides enough incoming revenue for the government to allow the middle class to benefit. So it's a wealth transfer from the ultra wealthy to the middle class, the way it was structured. And we voted on that. We passed it out of the House right before the holiday, and that was kind of a cool bill becomes a law moment. That was one that may have been one of the first bills that I dropped in the hopper and then sort of shepherded it through and got it through and passed it off the House floor. Now, realistically, for that one, there isn't a chance that the Senate's going to take that one up because the Republican leadership still takes pride in that tax bill. And so we're, and that's, they're for the people who get them into office, that was an important bill. So we're going to, I'm glad that we did what had to be done in the House, but I would be very surprised if that one saw the light of day in the Senate until we flip a few seats, 4 to be precise.
Right. Next question would be, most recently you sent a letter asking the department to issue federal guidance banning public schools' use of seclusion and restraint practices that restrict students' breathing and other life-threatening conditions. I can't imagine why that would why you would need to say that.
Yeah, well, did you have a chance to read that ProPublica article in the Tribune? I mean, just utterly shocking conditions. And I didn't really know anything about the issue until the ProPublica article came out, other than that I sit next to Ayanna Pressley on the Financial Services Committee, who's also she's just a good person. And she has recently released her own manifesto, which is all on overhauling the criminal justice system. And she's got a lot of members of her family who have spent time in and out of the criminal justice system, and for low-level crimes. I mean, her family's been in jail for things that, like, a lot of friends of mine in college did as well, but white people don't go to jail for these things. And so she has released this whole program to do that, and a part of it is the sort of, school to prison pipeline. And so she had sort of heightened my awareness of the issue just in our conversations and, during committee. And then saw this, the story that this is actually going on in Chicago. And I'm going to forget, but I think there's only 5 states that have actually said that you can't use this as a way to sort of manage a classroom. And this is horrible. I mean, these are kids who are, in some cases, the kids are being like locked in a room. They take off their pants. They're defecating on themselves. They're being, locked in and not dealt with. And Illinois, to their credit, I believe Governor Pritzker has temporarily suspended. It's not a permanent elimination, but I think temporarily while they study or something else. And so we just thought, talked with Senator Durbin and said, let's let Secretary DeVos know that we need to do this. So we got, I think all the Democrats in the Illinois delegation signed on the letter. I know Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, Congressman Davis, Schakowsky, Underwood, Foster, Lipinski. I'd have to check. I think we got everybody on, but you can find the letter. And then also added Ayanna Pressley on the letter as someone there and to carry it. And just to get Secretary DeVos to say, there's no way that someone can justify this behavior. Now what's I think at least interesting to think through on this, and I'm certainly not making the case for the treatment, but in the course of talking with some friends who, work in the public schools in the special education realm, we don't give them enough resources in terms of the training or the financial resources to really have the kind of tools that they need when you're in a room where there's someone who does have some behavioral issues, who's acting out, who's disrupting the class. And I've not heard from anybody that they object to us stopping this practice, but I do think I'd like this to maybe lead to a larger conversation around how do we make sure that our public schools, which, as they should, educate everybody, right? But that also means they need to have the resources to deal with every kid, not just the kids who are easy to teach.
So true. Very true. So I know that being involved with a bunch of campaigns, it takes a lot of energy and effort to make sure that you win in 2020, which is essential. And so what can we do to help you from the volunteer perspective?
So I forget who said it, but I'll take credit for it. Somebody said once that all it takes to win an election is time, talent, and treasure, and of the three of those, only one of those is distributed equally. Everybody has the same amount of time, right? And so obviously we'll be fundraising, and if people want to support, please do, because we need to get our name out. But the number of days between now and election day is the same for everybody. And what changes is the number of boots we have on the ground to really make the most of that. And we were extremely fortunate last time to have just a tremendous amount of people who came out and volunteered. That last weekend before the election, we knocked 100,000 doors. And that's pretty magical. We are gearing up and trying to rebuild that energy and do it in a presidential cycle. The first big event we'll have will be what we are branding as Camp Casten on March 21st. You can go on our Facebook page or I guess really on the Facebook page and sign up, but it'll be the first, it's either a Saturday or Sunday after the primary. And just getting all those volunteers to come back out and realize, okay, it's March, the election's in November, let's start gearing up again and working through. That'll be the big kickoff, and if folks are not already on our email list, you can go to the Facebook. If you look up, I got to remember this, Sean Casten for Congress on Facebook, you will get all the campaign side stuff we're doing. And if folks want to come to official stuff, we've done 23 town halls, we'll keep doing those. I have to wear 2 different hats, but you can do that through the Congressman Sean Casten Facebook page, or get on our official site email list at congress.gov and can find that out. The last thing that I just say, and this is bigger than me, because the job is bigger than me, is that I think what 2020 has to be about is a restoration of trust. We've gone 4 years with a president who has violated every norm, who has lied, and we can't even keep up. I mean, I feel like our oversight function in Congress has become a triage operation because there's so many things to keep tabs on. And I think for the sake of our democracy and for the sake of our standing in the world, we need to prove that this was an anomaly. And so, as people go through and think about what they're going to do in this cycle, trust, be honest, maintain some sense of civic virtue. Not that we're all perfect, none of us are perfect, but a recognition that there's a handful of us who have the amazing good fortune to be the temporary custodians of a pretty beautiful government. And the minute we think about ourselves as being bigger than that government is when the whole thing falls apart. And, elect people who understand that and jealously defend the institution against those who would question that. And I think if we do that, we're going to be all right. But if we start thinking that this is about, the beliefs of one tribe or one party are better than the other, we've missed the point. This is about defending democracy and being deeply suspicious of anybody who would believe that disenfranchising people or spreading falsehoods because that way they can get elected justifies their participation in the public square. So, fight the power.
Well, I'm a big fan of fighting the power. And I hope that more people do. I think that it would be wonderful if we could restore the trust, because it's definitely deeply lacking. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Diane.